Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the chilling secret of the child who erased an entire family from history that you might have never heard before, a mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know where are you listening to this story from. That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. In the forgotten hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains fold into one another like ancient sleeping giants, some stories are not merely told, they are absorbed by the soil itself. They become part of the land, a lingering chill in the air, a silence in the woods where there should be birdsong, a shadow that moves when no one is looking. Among these is the legacy of the Elbridge family, a name that, even today, is spoken in whispers, if it is spoken at all, a name that carries the weight of a peculiar, unspoken dread. On old, brittle land surveys from the turn of the 20th century, I found the crooked square of their homestead, a geometric scar carved into the wilderness between Jackson County, Kentucky, and the Virginia border. It exists on paper as a testament to a family's claim on the earth. But if you were to follow that faded map today, drawn by a cartographer's steady hand long since turned to dust, you would find no home. The path, once worn by wagons and bare feet, has been swallowed whole, erased by a century of seasons. You will only find what the forest has permitted to remain scattered brickwork, like broken teeth, and a collapsed foundation, strangled by a knot of roots as thick as a man's arm. The forest has taken it back, with a slow, deliberate hunger that suggests it was not merely reclaiming territory, but burying a memory, a stain it could not wash away. The silence here is profound, heavy, as if the very air is holding its breath. Locals who have dared to venture near speak of a place where compasses spin and modern electronics fail, where the bird song that fills the surrounding woods dies abruptly at an invisible line. It is as if nature itself has drawn a quarantine around the poisoned ground where the Elbridge house once stood. And perhaps it should have stayed buried forever. The first official indication that something was profoundly biblically wrong with the Elbridge line does not appear in a dusty police file or a sensational newspaper headline. It emerges, cold and stark, from the quiet, bureaucratic pages of history, from a document meant to count souls, not condemn them. The 1869 United States Census, in an entry written with graphite pencil so faint it has nearly surrendered its secrets to time, lists the head of the household as Jonah Elbridge, a farmer of 38 years. He is a man of the earth, his existence defined by crops and seasons. Beside him, a stark contrast, his wife Mary, aged just 17, little more than a child herself. Under the column for children, a single, hopeful word is inscribed, a testament to a future yet unwritten expected. It is a simple, unremarkable portrait of frontier life, of hardship and hope intertwined. But a decade is a long time in the hollows. It is long enough for hope to fester and die. In the 1880 census, the portrait curdles into a nightmare. Jonah Elbridge, the farmer, the head of the house, is gone, vanished from the record. Mary, now listed as the head mistress of the home, remains. The true chill, however, crawls from the list of those living with her, a list that defies all logic and natural law. 7 children, all bearing the Elbridge surname, their ages ranging from infancy to early adolescence. No other adults are listed in the home. And in the column designated relation to head of house, the census taker, a man whose job was to impose order on the chaos of human lives. For each of the 7 children wrote the same unsettling word, unknown. This was not a clerical error. You can almost picture the man sitting in that dim cabin, the silence pressing in on him, asking the question again and again, only to be met with an unnerving calm from the young woman before him. The repetition of unknown is a testament to his own bewilderment, an official surrender to an answer that made no sense. It was the first official record of an enigma, a family that did not add up, a household whose mathematics seemed to belong to a darker, older arithmetic. The official death certificate for Jonah, filed in a nearby county seat, claimed he succumbed to natural causes, a convenient and final explanation. But the doctor who signed it, a man of science named Alistair Finch, would later betray his own sterile, professional conclusion. In a private journal, a small leather-bound book recovered from a historical archive in 1972, he wrote a far more disturbing truth. His script spiraling with agitation. There was nothing natural about what I saw in that house. The entry reads, Jonah's body lay upon the bed for 3 days, and they would not let me touch it. Mary, the child wife, showed no grief. Her eyes were as placid as a frozen lake. He died with his eyes wide open, the pupils pinned, a look of abyssal terror fixed upon his face. His mouth was packed with hardened beeswax, sealing whatever final words he might have uttered. Mary refused to allow burial until the 3rd day, saying only that she was waiting for a sign. A sign of what? I dare not guess. The silence of the Elbridge family had begun, a legacy of blood, wax, and ritual that was just starting to seep into the land. This kind of profound, hermetic isolation was only possible in a place like Macabre County in the late 19th century. It was a world unto itself, a pocket of steep hills, dense forests, and deep ravines where the modern world's laws and logic grew thin and frayed. Here, communities were bound not by telegraph wires and railroads, but by shared bloodlines, ancient superstitions passed down from Scots-Irish ancestors, and a collective, unspoken understanding that some doors are best left unopened. The Elbridge Ridge was one such door. It was a place apart from a place already apart. The family became ghosts in their own time, specters on the edge of the community's vision, disappearing and reappearing across history not as people, but as omens. Their presence was felt not in the pews of the local church or the aisles of the general store, but in the afflictions that plagued their neighbors. When a blight turned a season's crops to black rot overnight, when livestock fell dead in their fields without wound or disease, when wells were mysteriously sealed with heavy stones, or when children who went picking berries in the woods never returned, a silent, fearful gaze would turn toward their ridge. Yet, no one dared to speak their name in accusation. To do so felt like an invitation, a drawing of a dark attention. Even in official letters to state authorities, penned by desperate farmers and worried mothers, the family was referred to only with a coded dread as them folks up the ridge. The phrase was a boundary line, a verbal fence built of fear. According to a private field book entry from a railroad surveyor in 1895, a man of maps and measurements, the unease was palpable. Avoid the Elbridge Ridge, he wrote, his pragmatic tone giving way to something more primal. The air changes up there, colder, heavier. There's singing from the trees some nights, a dissonant, layered sound in no language I know. The men I hired from the local town say it's just the girls practicing hymns. I don't think so. Hymns don't make the hairs on your arm stand up. They don't sound like they're being sung to something deep in the earth. The land itself seemed to be an accomplice, shrouded in a fog of fear and folklore that kept the outside world at bay. It was the perfect incubator for the darkness that was growing, being cultivated within the Elbridge home. To understand that darkness, one must look not at the men who vanished, but at the women who remained. The women of the Elbridge line were the true keepers of the family's strange covenant, the priestesses of whatever faith they served within that crooked, shadowed house. Our only clear glimpse into their world, our only first-hand account, comes from a woman who was paid to be observant, a woman who broke the unwritten rule and walked up that forbidden path. Her name was Martha Caldwell. In the spring of 1904, she was a field nurse, a pragmatic and resilient woman assigned to travel the rural backwoods of Kentucky under the new Public Welfare Mothers Act. She was not a journalist or an adventurer. She was a government employee, tasked with checking on births and infant health, a beacon of modern science in a pre-modern world. Her journey to the Elbridge Hollow was meant to be routine, one of dozens of inspections she performed that season. But what she found would strip the routine from her life forever, replacing it with a quiet, creeping horror. She never spoke of the visit to her family or friends, but her official ledger, discovered in the dusty attic of a government storage barn in 1967, tells the story she could not. The entries begin with her usual neat, professional cursive. April 14th, 1904, arrived at Ridge by foot. She wrote, "The path is barely there. Air close, forest unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects. The only sound is my own shoes on the dry soil." As she approached, the house revealed itself, not as a home, but as a deformity on the landscape. Structure crooked, roof sagged, smells of turpentine and elder root. She knocked, her knuckles rapping against warped, sun-bleached wood. The door was opened by a girl no older than 12, with bare feet caked in dirt and a dress as thin as a winding sheet. Child would not speak, Martha noted, her professional detachment beginning to fray. Eyes glassy, pupils wide in the daylight, not unkind, just watching me like a hawk watches a field mouse. Lured inside not by an invitation, but by the girl's silent, inexorable retreat, Martha stepped from the bright Appalachian sunlight into a world of perpetual twilight. All the windows were covered, not by curtains, but by dense, brittle bundles of dried plants tied with what looked like animal sinew, casting the room in a sickly green gloom. The air was thick, suffocating, a strange cocktail of scents, the sharp tang of pine, the waxy smell of countless candles, and something else, something metallic and sweet, like old iron and decay. She saw multiple girls inside, perhaps 5 or 6, moving with a synchronized, silent purpose. They all looked disturbingly alike, with the same pale faces and glassy eyes. An older matriarch, her face a mask of white powder, sat in a high-backed chair by the coal hearth, humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. It was the details, however, that began to scream at Martha's rational mind. There was a large pot simmering over a low fire, emitting a scent that was both sweet and foul. Martha, who had seen all manner of poverty and squalor, wrote that it smelled off. I saw something surface in the broth, and it had teeth. And then there were the mirrors. In every corner of the main room, a mirror was hung, but all of them were turned to face the wall, their reflective surfaces hidden. Were they hiding from their own reflections, or preventing something else from looking out? Her professional duty compelled her to ask about recent births. She was led into a back room, even darker than the first. There, another girl, smiling a smile made hideous by a complete lack of front teeth, held out a swaddled form. This, she was told, was the newborn. The bundle was too still. The skin of the infant within had a waxy grey pallor, and there was no sign of breath, no flutter of life. Told the infant was born of blood promise. Martha wrote, the strange phrase clearly unsettling her. She declined their offer of tea and fled as quickly as her dignity would allow. But her professionalism was a shattered shield. At the very bottom of the ledger page for that day, in ink that was darker, blotched by a hand that was visibly shaking, she added a final, terrified assessment that was anything but official. This is not a family. This is a vault. Something is kept here. Martha Caldwell never returned to the ridge. She refused all further assignments in the mountains and soon resigned her position. Locals from her town said she changed after that day, growing pale and silent, prone to staring at walls for hours. She died 7 years later, in 1911, at the age of just 36. Her doctor, unable to find a physical cause, wrote a hauntingly simple diagnosis on her death certificate. Exhaustion of unknown origin. She was the first outsider to look into the abyss of the Elbridge family. And the abyss had looked back, draining the very life from her. Martha Caldwell's quiet, lonely death in 1911 should have been a warning, a flare of crimson against the deep green of the hollows. But it was a warning written in a language of silence and implication, a language the world outside the ridge could not yet read. For years that followed, a deceptive veneer of normalcy settled back over the Elbridge property. The suffocating silence that had so unsettled the young nurse was, after all, the natural state of things in those deep woods. The family remained a subject of folklore, a ghost story whispered to keep children in line. But the tangible, palpable fear that had once gripped the community began to fade, receding into the mists of memory like a bad dream upon waking. They were simply them folks up the ridge, a permanent but distant feature of the landscape, like a strange rock formation or a blighted patch of trees that refused to grow. This uneasy peace, however, was not a healing. It was merely the drawing of a breath before a long, piercing scream. In the autumn of 1919, that scream would finally tear through the heart of Whitley County, shattering the fragile tranquility forever. It began on a crisp Sunday afternoon, the kind of day filled with the clarifying scent of wood smoke and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. Two cousins, 9-year-old Samuel Rayburn, a boy known for his adventurous spirit, and 7-year-old Betty Jo Clemens, a girl with hair the color of corn silk, went out foraging for wild berries in the woods just after church services. Their laughter, bright and clear, echoed through the trees as they chased each other down a familiar path, their wicker baskets still mostly empty. It was an image of pure pastoral innocence, a Rockwell painting brought to life in the Appalachian hills. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. When they failed to return by dusk, a quiet maternal worry spiraled into a frantic, community-wide search. Lanterns, like captured stars, bobbed through the darkening forest as nearly every able-bodied man in the county joined the desperate effort. Their trail was easy enough to follow at first, the small footprints leading past a dry creek bed and into a dense thicket of pine that marked the unofficial boundary of the Elbridge property. And then, abruptly, it simply vanished. There were no footprints leading out of the thicket, no torn scraps of cloth clinging to branches, no signs of a struggle with man or beast. It was as if the earth itself, with its ancient, silent patience, had opened up and swallowed them whole. Only one thing was left behind, a single heartbreaking piece of evidence. Betty Jo's small sunbonnet, wedged deep in the thorns of a blackberry bush. One of the searchers who carefully pulled it free, his hands rough and calloused, noted that the inside of the bonnet was damp, though it had not rained in weeks. That single inexplicable detail was the final straw. The whispers that had haunted the region for decades now roared in the ears of Deputy Franklin Harker. Harker was a war veteran, a man who had returned from the mud and industrial slaughter of the trenches in France with a permanent limp and a hardened, pragmatic temper. He had witnessed the horrors that men were capable of inflicting upon one another in broad daylight, and he had little patience for the superstitious fears and sideways glances that paralyzed his neighbors. He knew the Elbridge family, knew they kept to themselves, but he also remembered the chilling words his own grandmother, a woman of the mountains, used to say as she looked toward the hazy peaks. "That ridge," she would whisper, her voice low, "is where God left off and something else took over." For Harker, the disappearance of 2 children was not folklore. It was a crime scene. Frustrated by the sheriff's political reluctance and the town's collective fear, Harker utilized a rare legal maneuver, filing a petition to forcibly inspect the homestead on grounds of suspected abduction and unlawful burial. The judge, weary of the decades of rumors and now faced with a potential tragedy he could no longer ignore, signed it. But when the call went out for a posse, no one would volunteer to go with him. The fear of the Elbridges was thicker than loyalty to the law. Eventually, Harker, accompanied by 2 grim-faced civilian men he trusted from the war men who had also seen the worst of humanity and were not easily shaken, rode up the ridge with dogs and shovels, determined to dig up the truth, or so we saw. No matter how monstrous it looked, what they found would never be spoken of officially again. It would be buried in a sealed report, a document that would itself become a legend. The homestead was eerily quiet when they arrived, the hunting dogs whining and planting their feet, refusing to approach the sagging porch. The front door was unlatched. They entered a house that felt not abandoned, but paused in time. A half-eaten meal of cornbread and beans, still warm, sat on the dining table. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of anyone at all. But as they moved through the silent rooms, the unsettling atmosphere began to congeal into true horror. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, arranged in a neat, judgmental row on a long wooden shelf, were dozens of hand-carved dolls. They were crafted with unsettling skill from local pine and birch, but their faces were not the simple, smiling visages of children's toys. They were portraits, each one meticulously carved to resemble a real person from the surrounding counties. Some of the older men with Harker recognized faces of people who had died or disappeared years ago, their likenesses captured with a mortician's precision. It was a gallery of the lost, a silent wooden congregation. And then they saw it, sitting alone on a small rocking chair by the window, as if watching the path, was a doll with yellow yarn for hair and a dress made from the same calico print Betty Jo Clemens had been wearing that Sunday. Stitched into the fabric of its tiny apron in crude red thread was a name, Betty Jo. A cold, heavy dread settled over the men, but the worst was yet to come. Harker, methodical and grim, began tapping the floorboards around the main hearth, his military instincts sensing a weak point, a hidden space beneath. He found it a cellar door, skillfully concealed beneath loose boards and a threadbare rug. Upon prying it open with a crowbar, a significant odor, described in his later, sealed report as one of rotten metal and damp earth, billowed out, so pungent it made the men recoil and cover their faces, steeling themselves. They descended a steep, narrow staircase into the darkness, their lanterns casting long, dancing shadows. The cellar contained 11 crudely built wooden crates, stacked against the far wall. Inside each, layered between bundles of dried, unfamiliar roots and folded linens, were preserved human remains. The report noted it was unclear if they had been embalmed or if some form of natural, Unholy desiccation had occurred, but the preservation was unnervingly perfect. They were not skeletons, they were bodies, their skin leathery and intact, their forms shrunken but whole. The specimens included infants, juveniles, and at least one adult female. At the bottom of Hawker's typed report, a single line had been scrolled in pencil by a hand that was clearly shaking, a detail too horrifying for the official record, yet too crucial for him to omit. It read, "The eyes are all open." The Elbridge name was struck from the census the following year. Officially, the family was declared to have migrated to unknown territories. But no documents ever surfaced, no train tickets, no property sales. The house was boarded up, the path blocked with barbed wire. The official story was a lie. A thin bandage placed over a wound too deep and septic to heal. And the locals knew it. They said the ridge still hummed at night, a low, buzzing sound like bees trapped behind a wall. They knew the Elbridges were never gone. They just sank deeper. For decades, the truth did just that. It sank into the earth, becoming a buried memory, a foundation of terror upon which new generations built their lives. Careful not to disturb the ground. The story of the cellar and the dolls became a local legend, exaggerated and distorted by time until it lost the sharp, unbearable edges of fact. It wasn't until the autumn of 1977 that the truth was disturbed again, not by the heavy hand of the law, but by the reckless curiosity of youth. A group of 4 college students from the state university, chasing local legends for a folklore project, broke into the now rotting Elbridge homestead. The air inside was thick and wet with the smell of mildew and decay. Furniture had collapsed into piles of splintered, skeletal wood and wallpaper peeled from the walls in long leprous strips, revealing the dark, stained slats beneath. But in the attic, beneath a set of loose floorboards pried up with a tire iron, they found something the house had kept safe. A secret it had held for over half a century, a ledger, bound in what looked like deerskin, its pages filled with a cramped, spidery, feminine handwriting. The front page bore a title, inscribed with a darker, more deliberate ink, "The Vessel's Book." The entries, dated from 1894 to 1921, were not a diary of daily life. They were a horrifying inventory, a sacrament of death. Each followed the same cold, ritualistic pattern. First, an account of a cleansing, often described in cold river water or fresh soil. Then a name, almost always male. And finally, the same chilling, declarative phrase, "He was taken. The line is pure. I remain open." Page after page, it became sickeningly clear. The male children of the Elbridge line, and perhaps others, had not run away, nor had they died of illness or misfortune. They had been systematically offered up, their departures recorded with the cold. Detached precision of a botanist cataloguing specimens for preservation. One passage from 1903 read, "Elijah would not stop crying. His eyes turned gray too soon. We wrapped him in river vine and returned him to the well. I bled for 7 days after. Sister said that was holy." Another, from 1918, was even more direct. "Thomas bore the mark too early. His teeth came in black. We sang until the roots stopped twitching." The final entry from 1921 was shorter, edged with a palpable desperation. "No more boys left. The seed withers. We wait for the next one born with the breath. We keep the house, and we listen through the trees." The students, horrified beyond measure, reported the find to the local authorities. Within a week, the ledger had vanished from the county sheriff's office, officially misfiled and lost to bureaucratic incompetence. But one of the students, a young woman named Jody Ramsey, had made a full photocopy, a fragile, ghostly copy of the truth that finally gave a voice to the family's silent, ritualistic horror. The Elbridge women were not grieving mothers. They were the keepers of the gate, and their wombs were the offering plates. The photocopy of the vessel's book answered the sickening question of what happened on that isolated ridge. It laid bare a century of ritualized sacrifice, transforming the Elbridge women from mysterious recluses into the meticulous record keepers of an abomination. But the ledger, for all its chilling detail, was silent on the most terrifying question of all: why? Why would any mother, generation after generation, offer her own child to the soil? The answer would not come from another dusty attic, but from the ostracized, almost forgotten fringes of academia, through the work of a man who saw the patterns everyone else had dismissed as folklore. In 1980, a folklorist from West Virginia University named Dr. Lyle Ransom published a controversial and career-destroying thesis titled The Rooted Womb, Appalachian Fertility, and the Legend of the Earth Mother. Tucked deep within its pages, buried beneath layers of academic jargon and obscure historical references, was a direct and disturbing connection to the Elbridge family. Dr. Ransom, a man obsessed with the deep, pre-Christian myths that still clung to the mountains like morning fog, claimed that long before European settlers arrived with their Bibles and their property deeds, the land that would become McCreary County was home to a cultic fertility practice. This practice was centered around a hungry, ancient, and deeply feminine entity known only in the oldest oral traditions as Mother Root. She was not a goddess of gentle harvest or benevolent nature, but a chthonic deity of exchange, a power that resided in the dark, damp earth and demanded a terrible price for its continued sustenance. She demanded offerings from the soil, not crops or coins, but bloodline. The earth is not just land, Ransom wrote, his prose electric with the conviction that his colleagues found unsettling. In Appalachian myth, it is a breathing archive of names, phases, sins, and wombs. To grow something sacred, you had to bury something sacred. He had spent years meticulously connecting disparate oral tales from local Shawnee and Melungeon communities, tracing a specific chilling phrase that appeared in each culture's folklore when speaking of the cursed land around the Elbridge Ridge. The one who bears the mark must return to feed the root. The mark, he proposed after cross-referencing his folklore studies with obscure midwife journals, referred to children born with strange, subtle signs, teeth that came in black, eyes of a peculiar, depthless gray, minor bone deformities, or an unexplainable, premature ability to speak in the twisted, ancient logic of the cult. These children were not seen as cursed or imperfect. They were chosen, sanctified, marked by the land itself for a singular, holy purpose to be sacrificed. Ransom's research went deeper, unearthing physical evidence that sent a tremor through the state's historical societies. He uncovered burial records from a small, defunct parish dating as early as 1849, showing that Elbridge infants were often buried with their umbilical cords still attached, a highly specific ritual detail found in similar earth-based fertility cults worldwide, meant to physically tether the spirit of the deceased back to the maternal source, and by extension, to the earth itself. In one horrifying case, the parish record, penned by a barely literate traveling minister, simply stated, "Born breathing, buried twitching." Dr. Ransom's horrifying conclusion was that the Elbridge women were not operating out of some isolated, familial madness. They were the last preservers of an ancient, terrifying rite. They had inherited the knowledge and the obligation through generations of geographic and genetic isolation, passing it down through oral tradition and ritual journals like the vessel's book. Their secluded homestead was not a home. It was a temple, and they were its last, fiercely devoted priestesses after publishing his findings. Ransom's academic reputation was shredded. His colleagues, men of sterile facts and figures, mocked him as a fantasist. His grants dried up. Within a year, he resigned from the university, a broken man. But his obsession did not end. He moved into a small, dilapidated trailer near the Elbridge land, determined to find the final, irrefutable proof. He was last seen in 1982, walking toward the ridge with a shovel over his shoulder. When officials finally searched for him, they found no body. They found only a circle of dried vines tied with what were later identified as human baby teeth hanging from the trees, and a single chilling note pinned to his trailer door. The final note was scribbled in a frantic hand. "She's still hungry." Ransom had provided the terrifying why, the ancient mythological framework for the family's actions. But it was only through the voices of the Elbridge women themselves, the founder and the heretic, that the full, monstrous scope of their doctrine was revealed. In the autumn of 1986, after the last living Elbridge, a woman named Lenora was committed to a state psychiatric hospital. The homestead was finally cleared for demolition, amidst boxes of faded quilts and rotting hymnals. Authorities found something buried inside a false-bottomed chest, a diary, bound in dark cowhide, its pages brittle but miraculously intact. The first page bore a signature in ink as dark as dried blood. Mary Beth Elbridge. October the 3rd, 1871. This was not a diary in the typical sense. It was a ledger of rituals, births, and punishments. A record of a doctrine passed from mother to daughter for over a century. The first entries were strange, but not yet monstrously so. "My son took sick today," Mary Beth wrote. "I placed lamb's ash under his tongue and tied his hands. If he dies, I will root his body beneath the trees, that his strength may return to the soil that gave it." But later entries grew darker, more dogmatic. The seventh child was born in red moonlight. His eyes did not open, and he breathed backward. I took it as a sign. He is to be preserved until she returns. That word "preserved" appeared again and again. It became clear that the Elbridge women did not bury all their dead in the Christian sense. Some were embalmed in primitive, unsanctified ways, their bodies hidden in cellars, in hollow trees, their spirits bound to the land. But the diary held one passage that investigators could barely believe, a founding statement of their faith. "The first oath was taken beneath the black moon," Mary Beth wrote. "I offered blood in my own womb, and the trees drank it well. From this line forward, each daughter must preserve one child, one root, one sorrow, for the line must be kept pure, and the root must be fed." This confession from the grave provided the doctrine. But it was another diary, discovered decades later, that provided the human horror. Not every daughter of the Elbridge line walked willingly to the altar. Nora Elbridge, born in 1931, was different, where her mother and sisters were devout, soft-spoken, and turned inward toward the secrets of the house. Nora was sharp, questioning, and drawn to the tantalizing light of the outside world. She secretly read books that weren't the family Bible. She wrote poems, and she begged to go to school. At home, she was being prepared for a sacred duty. The preparation began on her 14th birthday. A lamb was slaughtered in the orchard, its blood collected in a wooden bowl. She was told to bathe in it, to purify herself for her role as a future vessel. When she refused, screaming and fighting, her mother locked her in the root cellar for 3 days with only water. "You must understand," her mother told her calmly through the locked door, her voice devoid of anger. Your womb is the garden. It must give, and it must take. This is the only way we survive. In a secret diary, a simple school notebook she kept hidden under a loose floorboard, Nora described the rituals in chilling detail. They want me to carry one, not to raise it, not to love it, just to birth it and then preserve it for the root. They say the family dies if the bloodline isn't sealed in sorrow. I will not be my mother's vessel. I will not be my sister's grave. At 16, Nora ran away for years. The family told neighbors she had died of a fever. Another name absorbed into the family's quiet tragedies. But Nora had survived. And what no one expected was what she would become. In 1974, she returned to Kentucky under a different name. Her face changed by time and sorrow. She was no longer a frightened girl. She was a state social worker. And she had one goal: to stop the ritual before another girl was chosen, before another child was taken. She worked quietly for years, using her position to monitor rural Appalachian communities. Looking for the signs she knew so well: children kept home from school, whispers of strange illnesses, families that refused all outside help. And then, a report came in from a teacher in Clear Hollow County about a girl named Anna, kept home, seen bruised, never speaking. Nora knew the cycle had begun again. She filed a request for a welfare check, but when she visited the Elbridge homestead, she was met with the gentle, smiling face of an old woman who did not recognize the long-lost daughter. The compound was empty of children, but Nora didn't believe it. She returned days later, alone, after dark, and broke in through the cellar door. Inside, by the light of a trembling flashlight, she found fresh evidence: a small girl's dress hanging near a dark stained table, still damp, 2 new glass jars filled with clear, viscous fluid, and the child's name, Anna, newly carved into a wooden beam. Nora photographed everything. She wrote down every detail. And that night, she mailed a parcel to a trusted colleague in Lexington, containing her notes, the photos, and a letter marked, "If anything happens to me, this is why." The next morning, her body was found on the roadside near the Elbridge orchard. Her car mangled. It was ruled a hit and run. No witnesses, no suspects, no investigation. The package of evidence never reached her colleague. It was intercepted and vanished from the postal system. The secret had been protected once again. But one thing did survive. Underneath the cellar, tucked behind loose stones, was a hidden iron box containing Nora's second diary. Her last entry was written hours before her death. "They don't preserve bodies," she wrote, her handwriting a frantic scrawl. "They preserve obedience, but rot always rises. And when it does, I hope someone remembers me. My name is Nora Elbridge, the one who said no." Nora Elbridge's final, defiant diary entry was a testament from the grave, a voice that had refused to be silenced. But a dead woman's words, no matter how true, could be dismissed as the ravings of a troubled mind. The iron box and its contents were a crucial piece of the puzzle, but it was not the evidence that would finally shatter the Elbridge family's century of silence. The final revelation would not come from human hands, but from the sky itself. In the summer of 1984, an unseasonably dry lightning storm, born from a volatile collision of heat and pressure, swept through Macabre County. It sparked a fire that consumed the dry brush and grassland with terrifying speed. A wall of orange and black that devoured everything in its path. But as the inferno reached the edge of the old Elbridge property, it came to a violent, unnatural halt at one eerie place: the overgrown, long-abandoned family orchard. Locals who arrived to help douse the flames described a stench unlike anything natural. It was not the clean, acrid smell of burning wood or leaves, but something sweeter, richer, and deeply nauseating. It was the smell of rotting flesh, cooked by the intense heat. What the fire revealed would haunt the community for generations. Beneath the now scorched orchard soil, in neatly spaced, deliberate rows, were human remains, tiny ones, dozens of them. The fire had burned away the earth and roots that had hidden them, exposing a secret graveyard. There were infant skulls no larger than a man's fist, delicate rib cages the size of a bird's, some still wrapped in the charred remnants of linen, with small numbered metal tags sewn into the fabric that still clung to bone. A forensic analysis conducted by state authorities later estimated over 40 infant and toddler remains, with burial dates ranging from roughly 1880 to the early 1950s. A few were likely natural deaths, stillbirths, or victims of disease in a time of high infant mortality. But many, according to the forensic report, bore fractures to the sternum and dislocated spines, injuries consistent with intentional, ritualistic trauma. One child's bones were found fused to a set of iron nails, driven through a wooden box that had been buried vertically, as if planted. Worse yet, botanists examining the soil after the fire found something chillingly consistent with the family's doctrine. The land had been repeatedly saturated with unnaturally high levels of calcium and iron, a chemical signature consistent with the complete breakdown of blood and bone marrow over a very long period. One of the lead investigators wrote in his private notes, "It's as if they were feeding the land. No plant can root in this spot again without extreme chemical remediation. The ground is ruined, poisoned from within." Locals remembered that the orchard had been planted by Mary Beth Elbridge herself back in the 1860s, and that only Elbridge women were ever allowed to pick from its trees. They grew pears, apples, and cherries known throughout the county for their deep, sweet flavor. After the fire, every tree died. A single photograph, taken by a volunteer firefighter and now buried deep in public archives, shows 3 burned trees still standing like skeletal sentinels in the center of the orchard. At the base of one, carved deep into the blackened bark, were faint, scorched words. The writing was on the inside of the tree's hollow, not the outside. Investigators could never explain how anyone could have carved inward with such precision. The words were womb, root, return. The horrific discovery in the orchard finally broke the dam of silence and fear. The legacy of the Elbridge family was now a shattered wreck, its secrets exposed to the harsh light of day. The focus of the investigation now turned to the last known living female bearing the name Lenora Elbridge. By 1985, she was only 43 years old, but a life spent in the shadow of the family's covenant had withered her, making her look closer to 70. She rarely left the dilapidated house that now stood alone on the ridge, never answered the phone, and when social workers came by after the fire, they found her sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, whispering nursery rhymes to an empty chair beside her. But behind her quiet, vacant decay, there was something else, a locked bedroom, a room that no one, not even the state, was allowed to enter for years. Her nearest neighbors had recalled hearing strange sounds from the house, particularly during heavy storms. They spoke of the sound of a child crying, sometimes screaming, always followed by Lenora's low, humming voice. One man said he knocked once during a torrential downpour to offer his help and heard a terrified child's voice call out from within, "Don't let her cut me again." But according to all official records, Lenora lived alone. Eventually, armed with the evidence from the orchard, state authorities obtained a warrant. What they found inside that locked room was, for many of them, the single most unspeakable sight of their careers. A child, a boy approximately 8 years old, was huddled in the corner. He was malnourished, mute, and his small body was covered in a network of faded and fresh ritual scars. He had a severe cleft palate that had never been treated, a partially fused arm, and burn marks on his back consistent with branding tools. He was seated in a hand-carved wooden crib, far too small for his age, surrounded by clumps of dried herbs and small cloth dolls impaled with pins. On the wall, above him, painted in what looked like berry juice, was the phrase, "He lives because she sinned," under questioning. Lenora's vacant facade cracked, not with remorse, but with a chilling, matter-of-fact logic. "He was born under the wrong moon," she admitted, her voice flat. "I tried to fix him. Mama said we don't bury the broken ones anymore. We keep them near. He listens better now." She believed the boy was the spiritual rebirth of her brother, who had drowned in the 1950s. Psychiatrists deemed her mentally unfit for trial, a mind so warped by a lifetime of ritual abuse that the concepts of right and wrong no longer applied. The boy, whose true name was never confirmed, was placed into state care and given the name James. He never spoke a single word. Years later, a nurse who worked with him would write anonymously in a memoir. "He never cried, and he never laughed," she wrote. "But he would stare at trees for hours, as if they were whispering to him. Once, during a full moon, he carved 3 words into his pillow with his fingernail. Lenora Elbridge, return." The legacy of the Elbridge family was now a shattered wreck, its secrets exposed to the harsh light of day. But there was one last voice yet to be heard, not a voice from a diary, but from a living survivor who had escaped the hollow. Her name was Esther Elbridge, though she lived under a protected identity. An old woman haunted by a childhood she had spent a lifetime trying to outrun. She spoke only once, in a 2004 documentary that was never publicly aired, its footage deemed too disturbing, in the only known recording of her testimony. Esther sits in a plain room, her hands folded, her voice barely above a whisper. She does not cry, but her stillness is heavier than any tears. The interviewer asks, "What happened the night it ended?" Esther stares for a long moment, then quietly replies, "It didn't end. They just stopped calling it a ritual." She describes the last night she spent at the homestead, around 1975. She would have been about 9 years old. That evening, her older cousin, May, had been chosen for completion. The room smelled of wax and cedar. Her grandfather sat in a high-backed chair, murmuring something that was not quite a prayer. May didn't cry. She smiled at Esther and whispered, "Don't forget my song." Then she lay on the table. Esther refused to turn her back like the others. She stood watching until her mother's hand pushed her aside. Later that night, she crept back into the cellar. May's body was gone. Only the scent of wax lingered, and a small red ribbon sat in the corner. Esther took it. She confessed she still has it, sealed in a glass jar. She says it still smells of Sunday candles and vinegar. After her confession, authorities made one final, formal attempt to excavate what they believed was the primary Elbridge burial site, a shallow moss-covered plot at the back edge of the former homestead, a place locals had long called the Quiet Patch. But the dig was halted before it could begin. The Tennessee Historical Preservation Office intervened, citing a clause buried deep within 19th century land deeds tied to an obscure religious exemption law. The land was legally protected as a site of cultural spiritual significance, And under that law, no excavation could occur without consent from a living descendant. And Esther, she refused. Digging won't change anything, she told them. You don't wake sleeping things just to prove they're dead. Still, investigators attempted non-invasive scans. Ground-penetrating radar detected several irregular, child-sized voids in perfect rows. No metal, no coffins, just shadows beneath the earth. A second scan 6 months later showed something stranger. One of the voids had shifted. In 2017, a folklorist named Dr. Marion Coates published a paper concluding that the Elbridge rituals didn't stop. They scattered like spores, moving deeper into the mountains, finding new families, new hollows. In late 2018, Dr. Coates vanished. Her car was found near the state park border. Inside was her laptop, a child's red ribbon, and a sealed envelope addressed, "To be opened if I am gone." The envelope was never made public. What then is the final truth of the Elbridge family? Why did they vanish from history? Their legacy scrubbed from records, their land fenced off and left to rot? Because it was never just about secrecy. It was about containment. A curse doesn't end simply because a bloodline dies out. It ends only when the last person refuses to feed it. In her final, leaked interview before she, too, disappeared in 2019, Esther Elbridge provided the last, terrifying piece of the puzzle. She spoke of receiving a letter with no return address. Inside was a single sentence, written in her mother's unmistakable handwriting: "The bloodline has not ended." Wrapped in tissue paper was a lock of jet-black baby hair, tied in a red ribbon. The hair, she said, was fresh. Esther ended the interview with a single chilling warning, a warning that echoes from the past into our present. "They don't need the mountain anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They don't need the cellar or the salt. They only need a willing womb, and those are easier to find than you think." The story of the Elbridge family, in the end, is not about a family at all. It is about an idea, a dark and hungry faith that has outlived its creators. It is a story that has not yet found its ending, a silence that is still waiting for the next scream.